USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at USAA.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Not all meals are created equal. For instance, breakfast has the spicy egg McMuffin for a limited time, and lunch doesn't. McDonald's breakfast comes first. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast Gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast Gems.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Makkai, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Believing that he is the sole survivor of an endless war, Hani, the adolescent protagonist of Jesse Browner's new epic of war's aftermath, Sing to Me, walks from his farm to the ruined city of Troy, seeking his lost younger sister, Irina. With only his trusted donkey, Ansa, for company, Hani crosses a landscape scarred and empty of people and civilization. When along the way he encounters a single soldier from the invading army, horribly wounded but still alive, barely, he will face a moral question that will mark him for the rest of the story. Should he treat the stranger with kindness and perhaps friendship, or dispatch him, knowing that he may be in danger should he recover? The aftermath of that decision powers a narrative that is at once a return to the Troy of Homer's epics and a new venture into that imagined world, a return that does not sing for battles, but for the ghosts of those who are lost and those who are found. Sing to Me puts the future of a civilization on the verge of rebirth in the hands of a child. His instincts and his intellect, his heart and his compassion provide another way forward than the endless series of rehearsals of old grievances and hates, a path that seeks truth in another's language and writes the future in symbols not yet known. Jesse Browner is the author of the novels The Uncertain Hour and Everything Happens Today, among others, as well as of the memoir How Did I Get Here? He is also the translator of works by Jean Cocteau, Paul Eluard, Rainier Maria Rilke, Matthew Ricard, and other French literary masters. He lives in New York City. Welcome to Burned by Books, Jesse.
Thank you very much. That was a beautiful introduction. I'm very grateful.
Thank you. I feel like this book, I've been on a sort of run of books that feel, in a way, kind of horribly applicable to our moment, but also yours is one that is, in the end, quite hopeful, and we can talk about that as we go. But I wonder if you would start by reading a passage from near the beginning of Sing to Me. It's the start of Hani's journey with his donkey, Ansa, and you could add any context to the section that you like.
Okay, well, where we begin is Hani and Ansa have set off across country searching for Hani's sister, Irina, and they don't fully know where they're going. They don't know the name of the city they're heading towards, but they are following the river just as Irina and their father did. So here we go. By noon, Hani and Ansa are as far from home as they have ever been. Hani would have been even further along if he'd left Ansa the donkey behind and taken the skiff, as the river is in flood and the city, they say, is directly downstream from the valley. But he feels like he would have been vulnerable on the river, easy to see from far away and with nowhere to hide. He also would have been lonely and even more scared than he already is if he'd been by himself. In any case, the road hugs the river all the way to the city. At least Hani is pretty sure it does, because this is the road everyone takes before they don't come back. And it's easy walking because there are few travelers to turn it into sucking mud, which is its usual condition at this time of year. And if someone comes along who looks like he would be best avoided, Hani and Ansa can just slink off into the woods or the underbrush until he has passed by. But as it turns out, there are no woods or underbrush. As they make their slow but steady way toward the war, Hani is surprised to find that this new valley is even more wrecked than his own. The next is likely to be even worse still. Back at home, most of the trees have been chopped down, and many houses are in need of serious repair. But even so, some livestock remain, a few fields have been plowed in preparation for sowing, and most farms are still managing to get some sort of bare-bones crew together for the spring planting. Just 2 or 3 planting seasons ago, the valley that Hani is passing through now would have been crawling with farmers, oxen, and mules at this time of year. This is supposed to be the season of hope and rebirth, where everyone is hard at work helping nature wake up from her long sleep. Instead, anyone can see that the fields were not sown last fall or spring, and maybe for an entire year before that. Even now in early spring, they're overgrown with thistle, mullein, and clover, and most likely could not be turned over even if teams and plowmen were on hand to do it. Other than a lone boatman glimpsed easing his raft into the bulrushes shortly after dawn, Hani has not seen a single human being since he left home yesterday. Nor has he heard the thud of an axe, the whistle of a shepherd, or the call of a cattleman. No bird song, no lowing herd, no barking dog, no cackling barnyard fowl, no pawing horse. The only sounds he has heard since rising this morning are his own footfall, the dull tread and snorting breath of Ansa at his side, the sigh of the breeze in the rushes, and the stream gurgling like a suckling baby. The orphan buildings strung out along the road and those set farther back in clusters below what used to be the tree line are long abandoned. Many have lost their doors, probably pulled off their hinges and broken up for firewood. Most have collapsed or collapsing roofs, their rafters and tiles pilfered, and not a few have clearly been put to the torch for the sheer fun of it. Here, a stone granary has been ransacked and lies sprawled on its side, as if pushed over by a giant hand. There, a wrecked mill squats, disintegrating over the stream that once powered it. Everywhere, the furrows choke on weeds, and the farmhouses gaze empty-eyed over delinquent fields and terraces, like parents who have been disappointed by their children once too often and no longer dare to hope that they will amount to anything. Hani and Ansa have met no one on the road, alive or dead. Whatever violence occurred here scared its victims away before it descended upon their homes. Maybe it was done to them. Maybe they did it to themselves. There's no way of knowing. In the early days of the war, whole communities uprooted themselves and fled to the safety of the forests. The refugees who passed through the valley could tell you where they came from, usually a village that no longer existed, but had no idea where they were going. The forests are long gone from the farming lowlands, so whoever lived here not so long ago is either dead or hiding in the mountains. There's a difference between hearing rumors of a distant war and seeing with your own eyes villages and farms that were just like your own only a short time ago and are now laid to waste. The outlines of the streets are all there, as are the footprints of the homes and farm buildings that were swept away by whatever storm blew through here, but all life has fled. Like a fresh corpse that can sense that something important has just happened to it, but can't quite manage to remember what it was. These ruined villages look as if they're dreaming that they're still alive and might wake up at any instant. But that instant is long past for these places. This is a dream they won't wake up from.
Thank you so much. That's really a beautiful example of how lyrical this novel is. And it gives us a sense of what it means for us to return to a place that, for those who've read about the Trojan War or read the Iliad or another Greek epic, have as a sense of what that war was. But this gives us a sense of a landscape in the aftermath, leveled and scarred and really empty. And I wonder what you were thinking when you imagined returning to those places, but having them really be emptied out of life.
Well, the Iliad touches on the hinterlands. In fact, it begins with a raid on a village that's a little bit further south down the coast from Troy. And it's not difficult when you imagine that the Greeks have been supporting themselves for the last 10 years from behind the barricade of their walled encampment. Where are they feeding themselves? Well, they're feeding themselves by raiding all up and down the coast, and to a certain extent, probably in the hinterlands behind Troy, that is, to the east of Troy. So I imagined Hani's village maybe 100 miles due east of Troy, which makes the war distant, but still they're aware of it. Their village itself is not affected, but villages a little bit further to the west have been. So the Greeks are a large host, and also, as are the Trojan defenders, they come from all over the region that is called the Troad, allies of Troy. And they've all had to feed themselves for the last 10 years. So it makes perfect sense that the land is ravaged, and that the closer you get to the city, the more devastated it's become, and the more scarce important resources are. One reason that I was glad to do this story is you don't really need to do a whole lot of research if you're writing about ancient Troy, because most of it is myth. You need to understand a little bit about the technology of Bronze Age architecture and agriculture and infrastructure. In theory, you need to understand a little bit about Hittite culture, since it's presumed that the Trojans were related in some way to the Hittite Empire, which is in the center of Anatolia. But other than that, you really just need to use your common sense and your imagination about what effects devastating war and siege like this would have on the surrounding community.
Ansa, the donkey, is a powerful figure in Hani's life. And Hani is certain, despite what his father tells him, that she has a soul. How does this non-human companionship allow Hani a different vantage on his life and on the world that he travels through?
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar, zero patience for slow walkers, those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night, have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Well, people have asked me how much of myself is in my characters. And I say, it's not me, it's wishful thinking. It's what I would like to be. And I would love to be as wise and as brave and as thoughtful and as observant as Hani is. But he's only 11 years old and he doesn't really believe that he's any of those things himself. So having the donkey as his companion allows him to project his own wisdom onto the donkey. She never talks to him in the book, but he's constantly talking about all of the wisdom that she imparts to him. The wisdom is his own. It's just that he's been told his whole life that he's useless and that he's stupid because he's sensitive to nature and he's sensitive to the way people are able to hurt one another. He lives in a society where small children can be bullied and can be belittled and can be harmed physically as he's seen all his life. And so he does not have any sense of who he is, but he does have a sense that he can draw wisdom from the silence of the donkey without understanding that it's his own innate wisdom that he's listening to. So she's a kind of a sounding board for him, if you will.
Yeah.
So she's also partly based on our late dog, Nola, who was a very, very great soul indeed and left us after 18 years. But I've always wanted to write a portrait of her, and it's not easy to write a book about a dog. It's a little easier to write a book about a donkey.
Well, I'm very sorry about that loss because I know what it feels like.
Thank you.
To lose a beloved animal and to understand them as having souls, even if they can't speak to us, which will, I'm going to get to the question of languages we don't understand because that's so fundamental to this novel. But you've already talked a bit about what it means to re-encounter the Trojan War. And we certainly get wonderful glimpses of the Iliad and of aspects of that myth, including the Trojan horse. But this is not a retelling, and as much as it's an encounter with the afterwards. How much did you want to be in conversation with Homer, and how did you decide what Honey would cross paths with and how your reader would experience those allusions?
Well, there's a lot of Homeric language embedded in the book. Subtly
Even
enough.
sing to me.
Yes, of course. I mean, that would be obvious if you knew from the beginning that you were dealing with Troy. In this case, because you see the whole world through Hani, and he has no idea of the time he lives in or the place he lives in. He's illiterate. He doesn't even know what language he speaks. So he himself has no sense at all of living through a great historic upheaval. But the language is in there for people to find. The name Troy never appears anywhere in the book. Again, that's because if Hani is a Hittite, the Hittites knew the city of Troy as Lovisa, and that name appears once, but unless you're an archaeologist and you're able to recognize the name of the Hittite name of the city or the name of the Hittite gods that Hani references, you'd never know where you were until at least 3/4 of the way through the book.
Mhm.
Again, the truth is that I wanted to write this book for someone perhaps who had never read the Iliad at all. You absolutely don't need to know anything about the story of the Trojan War to read this book. It's in many ways, it's a generic war. Everything that is there, the child victims, rape, indiscriminate slaughter, and pillage and looting, those are things that are common to every war that has ever existed and has ever been fought over since, time began. Nevertheless, for those who have read the Iliad I use a lot of Homeric adjectives here and there. I tried to be subtle about it so that it wasn't too obvious. If you're reading it line by line and you're very familiar with the Iliad, some of it might pop out to you, but not very much other than the first line of the book.
It feels like the voice of so you're writing in free and direct discourse, and it feels like that narrative voice is very inflected by Homer. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the choice to use FID, free and direct discourse. It's perfectly done in that the narrator is both separate from but sutured to Hani, capable of thinking and feeling alongside him with occasional critical perspectives on his actions. What were the assets and perhaps even some difficulties in employing free and direct discourse?
Well, primarily the primary difficulty of it is the language has to be appropriate to an illiterate 11-year-old farm boy.
Mm-hmm.
That took me quite a while. It always takes a good third of the book to find the voice, and then you have to go back and rewrite from the beginning. And I have readers who I trust, and I kept simplifying the language and getting as much complicated vocabulary out of it as I possibly could so that it would sound like an 11-year-old farm boy who had never left home. I'm not sure how successful it is. There's one moment in the book where he has to dig very deep to find an adjective to describe Ansa and his love for her. And he uses a word that he would not normally ever use. And so to justify that, I mentioned that he actually had to ask people for words that they would not normally use on the farm. And that's how he came up with these words for his donkey, because otherwise, he says, in fact, at one point he says, nobody in the valley ever uses the word beautiful except to describe livestock. And so when he begins to use it to describe the soul of his donkey, he feels very self-conscious about it. So that was the difficulty. And, you do enough drafts and you overcome those problems. But the payoff is infinitely worthwhile because now you have a voice that is pure and direct. And in the case of someone who is as innocent of the world as Hani is, it would be very, very difficult to find a different form of narration that could encapsulate the purity of his imagination, his sense of wonder, his sense of fear, and also fearlessness, which he's unaware of. And that is the real beauty of having this direct, or rather indirect, third person narration, is you're inside his head all the time. Now, I've used this before in other novels. In fact, in all of my last 3 novels and in the novel that I'm writing now. And I don't think I'll ever go back to any other form of narration. It's in the present tense, which keeps the reader right up there in the saddle with Hani at every moment, and every surprise that Hani experiences is experienced simultaneously by the reader.
On his odyssey across the wasteland of the war's aftermath, Hani encounters a soldier who he believes is dead, but who proves otherwise. His encounter with the soldier from the invading army will prompt the most important moral question of the book. How do we treat strangers? Do we lead with fear and dispatch them, or do as Hani does and act with kindness and care, perhaps even friendship? This is, of course, a powerful critique of our current moment and failure to act as Hani does. But would you say that this is perhaps the oldest and most intractable moral quandary for humans as a species? And how did you want to grapple with it through Hani?
Yes, it's without a doubt, it's the subject of every book I've ever written. Is the protagonist trying to answer a very simple question: is what does it mean to be good, and how do you do it? And it is extremely complicated, and it's difficult for Hani to figure it out. Hani, one thing that you have not mentioned is that the soldier is mute for reasons that are not explained, which you could take as PTSD or for whatever reason. So Hani has no idea whether the soldier is one of his own or one of the enemy. But he also has no sense of who was fighting or what they were fighting about. And therefore, the idea of a friend and a foe is almost meaningless to him. All he knows is that having spent his entire life in a place where animals and children are readily harmed and killed, he does not want to be that kind of person. And he ultimately decides that he is going to apply the same categories of moral inquiry to his treatment of the soldier as he does to the helpless animals that he's tended to on the farm.
Hmm.
And then he also surprises himself. He makes one plan and he's about to go through with it and he can't. And that helps him to learn something incredibly important about himself, even as he's navigating all of these great perils and unknown pitfalls.
I want to talk now about the soldier's mutism and also the way that Hani and the soldier begin to have discourse. But I had taken the soldier's muteness as elective, as a choice. And perhaps, out of, as you say, a PTSD of having seen too much that it was no longer worth speaking words. And then he encounters Hani, who treats him with such unexpected and extraordinary kindness and care that he begins to broach into language again. And he attempts to engage him in written language, something that, as you say, Hani is illiterate and has never learned. And through intelligence and patience, both Hani and the man begin to learn to communicate, despite speaking different languages and one person being illiterate and the other literate in a language that doesn't correspond to Hani's. You write quite profoundly, I think, that he and the soldier are building the world, one new symbol at a time. Sing to me imbues the sharing of meaning across languages with a great hopefulness for something other than the repeat of fear and violence in the world. Can you talk about these scenes of language sharing in the novel and also perhaps connect them to your work as a translator?
Oh, that's an excellent question. In fact, I had a whole evening with one of our best translators, Mark Palizzati, who's a translator of French literature, and that's exactly what we discussed. So the Trojan War took place right at the end of the Aegean Bronze Age. So maybe 1800 years, no, less, 1100 years BC. And immediately after the Trojan War, all of the Aegean civilization collapsed and the Eastern Mediterranean descended into what has been known as the Greek Dark Ages, where all literacy was lost. So there's this poignancy because the book is kind of modeled on a post-apocalyptic journey, say like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, that we know that this city is not only destroyed, but the entire civilization that it represents is about to descend into anarchy for the next 400 years. The language, the writing system that the soldier teaches Hani is what's known as Linear B. It was used during the Minoan and Mycenaean, well, not Minoan, sorry, that was Linear A, during what's known as the Mycenaean Age. And it was lost forever until early in the 20th century.
So is it an ideographic language?
It's
then?
partially. There's some, part of it is syllabic, part of it is ideographic, and it's mostly, I'm not a professional linguist, but mostly it's syllabic, which means that every image corresponds to a consonant and a vowel sound. Ta, pa, na. So in the book, when Hani eventually learns to read and he learns this soldier's story, Greek names do not come out the way we know them in Linear B. So, for instance, the soldier's father comes out as Nesuto, when in fact he's Nestor, who is a character that we know from the Iliad. In the same way, we have Patarokolo, which is Patroclus, and Achireu, who is Achilles. There's very little of that in the book because, frankly, it's irrelevant and it's really kind of more fun for Homer scholars than it is for regular readers, and I didn't want to overplay that. But the fact is that we are about to descend into a dark age, and civilization is going to have to reemerge somehow out of this chaos and violence and destruction. We know it does reemerge 400 years later in what's known as archaic Greece, which is, the beginning of the golden age of Greece. And of course, of Homer himself, who, if he was a real person, did not begin writing the Iliad until many centuries after the Trojan War. So that's what I was trying to do, and that's why I was trying to be at all times hopeful, because I do know, unlike Hani and the soldier, that civilization will be revived, and it will be revived better than the way it was, but they don't know that. All they know is that they have to find a way to translate to translate their mutual silence for one another. And they, despite everything, despite the fact that one of them is illiterate and has no sense of what civilization is or what it could possibly mean, and the other one speaks a different language, but comes from a very cultured and educated background, they have to find a way to communicate with each other. And eventually, together, they do. And so, in a way, it's kind of a model for the rebirth of civilization.
Yeah, that's very much. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, which is, of course, exactly what translation is. Civilization would not exist without translators, because we need the perspective of those we deal with outside of our own culture.
And it reminded me, not in a kind of exact mirroring and perhaps in sort of kind of opposition to some scenes in J.M. Coetzee's novel Foe. I don't know if you've read that.
I have not, no.
It's a retelling of Robinson Crusoe. And there are scenes of teaching or attempting to teach Friday written language. And in Foe, he rejects it, but he rejects it because he's being gifted with an oppressor's language, or at least we think that, because he doesn't speak. But I really loved how much it felt like there was this sort of building up through kind of two two ways of using language to understand the world and thinking about language as the only way we know our world, and therefore a sharing of it is a kind of a deep sharing of difference and understanding that seems so, I mean, we're so bafflingly absent of it these days. Honey calls his search for his missing sister, Irina, his war. This contrasts with the war that has obliterated civilization. And Honey's duty to his family and to the soldiers stand in stark contrast to what he sees as the violence wrought by the same kinds of men again and again. I felt like the distinction between these two kinds of commitments points to two futures. One that will see the city repopulated by the same kind of people who made this war, and one led by Honey's move to claim his freedom on a farm, perhaps with another donkey. How does this sit with your sense of the novel, the distinction between these two futures?
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Got some good news for your ears. More of that good stuff is coming up. And even better news for your hair. The best hair care is at Sephora. They've got all kinds of products for every kind of hair. From brands like Amika, Kerastase, Day, and K18. You knew where to get great audio. Now, you know where to get great hair care too. Sephora, good news for great hair. Shop hair care now at Sephora.com.
Well, I would have to say that having an optimistic outlook does not come naturally to me. You know, this book is imbued with the optimism of an 11-year-old who doesn't really understand how the world works. We know that he will go on to try to create a better world than the one he's known, and he actually says so explicitly that that's his intention. But we also know that Troy will be rebuilt by exactly the same kind of people who destroyed it, and that Troy will be destroyed and again, and Mediterranean culture will be destroyed, and that for every moment of optimism, there is a long, slow decline. You know, but the thing is that when you start to think about it, and this again applies to translation, I mean, every story begins with a misunderstanding. And it is the misunderstanding that sets the story in motion, and people are groping to understand what's happened and to set things to right. In some ways, you could almost say that is the story of human history. You know, we were euphemistically in the Garden of Eden, where we understood everything, and then we asked a question, and suddenly we were alienated from the universe, and we've spent our entire existence trying to get back to that place where we no longer have to ask questions because we understand the universe and our place in it implicitly and innately. And to me, that is really the movement that propels almost every story that's worth telling. Is I didn't understand what you said, or I didn't understand what you did, And now I have to go on a journey to reconcile myself with what has happened and try to make it right. So if that's true, and it's very easy to disagree with me, I've only came up with that right now because I'm talking to you. If that's true, then again, every story in and of itself has the seeds of its own optimism and its own disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
Those would be the tension and the counter tension that move it along. But, as I said, that's an untested theory, to put it mildly.
Oh, I'm buying into it, untested even as it may be. I feel like the other thing that goes along sort of hand in hand with the potential of translation and the sharing of language is a question of forms of sorrow. Sing to Me speaks of a kind of sorrow, a crying without consolation, that is not sorrow for oneself, but for the world, a deep, empathetic well of sorrow. And I read these moments in the book with a sense of despair and thinking of the scenes of war and devastation that we are treated to every day now, and thinking that people are not indeed crying for the world in response to those images. And while the novel ends with, I think, a great deal of hope and possibility, despite what we know about who will rebuild Troy, I wonder how you thought about that kind of melancholia in the sense of that the Greeks had it, a sorrow without end. Do you think that in the novel and in our own despoiled present, whether there is the possibility of crying for the world?
Well, let me start by telling you that you can't raise a family in New York City on what you earn as a literary novelist. And virtually all of us have jobs to support the writing habit. And in my case, I spent 30 years as a translator in the Security Council at the United Nations. And if that is not enough to steep you in infinite, inconsolable sorrow, I don't know what is.
Oh, God.
Because not only are you privy to just the worst that human beings can do to one another day in and day out, you're also privy to the efforts of very flawed human beings to figure out how to prevent it and watch them as they fail again and again and again and again. I could be very cynical and say that very few of them actually are very interested in succeeding, since everybody at the UN represents a nation state that sees its own interests in a very different light and not necessarily supported by peace, understanding, and mutual assistance. Even if they are all women and men of great goodwill, they have still failed again and again and again. And I watch them do it every day for half of my life. I happen to be, when you work in the Secretariat at the UN, you are under an oath of discretion and secrecy to the Secretary General. And so I was never able to write about that. When I retired, I didn't immediately think, I'm going to write about war, because I've been frustrated about it for all these years. But it was definitely there for me. And I was thinking a lot about it. When I retired from the UN a couple of years ago, it was maybe 6 months into the war in Ukraine. And I had that very, very much on my mind as I was writing this book. And indeed, there are passages that which I hope would remind you very much of what we read about the suffering of children and women in warfare. And then as I was writing it, the war in Gaza erupted. And in some ways, the images from that were even worse than what we saw in Ukraine. And that was on my mind with every single word that I wrote in this book. I mean, everybody knows that children are the primary victims of war and the most voiceless. You might be surprised to learn that there are absolutely no children in the Iliad at all. There's one scene where Hector is holding his son before he goes off to confront Achilles, but his son is just a prop. And so the idea, we all know, again, that in the ancient world, when a city was invested and destroyed, the women and children were carried off to slavery and everybody else was murdered. Hani sees that as he walks through Troy. In fact, he wonders, he can't understand where are all the children? Where are all the women? All he sees is old people and dead soldiers who have been slaughtered. Those were things that, I heard about again and again and again and again. Not that anything I learned working in the Security Council was a secret. It's in the newspapers every day, but hearing those accounts by eyewitnesses is not really conducive to having a very rosy outlook on the human capacity for change, compassion, or brotherhood.
I'm guessing that you've read Katie Kitamura's Intimacies.
Yes, of course I have. And I'm friends with a lot of interpreters who did things, who had to do exactly what she did. And I heard people giving testimony in the Security Council that was very similar to what she heard as she's defending this war criminal in The Hague. I was not an interpreter. I was preparing the official records of the Security Council, but nevertheless, that's the sort of thing we were subjected to day after day.
Well, lest we leave on perhaps a depressing note, I would love to know a little bit about what you have been reading and loving recently, and if you might have some recommendations for my listeners.
Well, I did mention that just before I wrote Sing to Me, I read Cormac McCarthy's The Road. That, of course, is not new. The newest book that I absolutely went crazy over was published last year, a Mexican author named Alvaro Enrique, who wrote You Dreamed of Empires.
I love that book.
Which is absolutely my favorite book of all of 2024. And I was at a party not long ago, and I started talking to this man about how much I loved the book. And it wasn't until I was 5 minutes into praising the book that I realized I was talking to the author.
No, stop.
And
stop it. That's too much.
That didn't stop me from making a fool of myself.
He must have been so touched.
Well, I think he was touched. I think, the book, he's written a lot of books, and I think this book was a big surprise to him at how popular it was. So I think he was still at the stage where he couldn't get enough of praise, and every bit of praise is well deserved. It's a great book, and he's got another book coming out this year. I think.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's exciting.
If I'm not mistaken, it's a book about the Apache warrior Geronimo, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic.
Oh man.
I was thinking also before we started about if you were going to ask me about what books I might have inspired. I absolutely adore Susanna Clarke's novel Piranesi.
Me too.
Also a really wonderful, innocent narrator whose innocence is never cloying. And it was a wonderful, inventive book. I'm glad I didn't have to do it. I don't really care for world building, which is why I chose to write about an apocalypse that has already taken place. That way I didn't have to create the kind of world that she created in Piranesi, but absolutely could not praise that book high enough. And
Yeah, it's really a unique book. The way that it uses a certain kind of form to make you feel things, I found very distinct from other things I've read.
And for me also, it's in a format that I've always tried to emulate, which is that when I was a teenager, I would do my homework and get into bed with a book at 10 o'clock at night, and I would read the entire book overnight if I could.
Oh my gosh.
And so I've always been drawn to short books that can be read in one sitting. Piranesi is like that. One of my other great favorites, it's not new, is a Hungarian novel from the 1920s called Skylark by an author who's very well known in Hungary, but almost completely obscure in the US, called Dezo Castellani. I absolutely love that. That's a book you can read. It's 120 pages. J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country is another book like that. So I always grateful to any author who can tell a full story in 120 pages. Sing to Me isn't quite that short, and my next book, sadly, is going to be quite a bit longer. I promised myself that I would try to keep it short, but it's not happening.
I love both short and long novels, so I will look forward to your next one. And these are wonderful, wonderful recommendations, but I really, really want to recommend to my listeners Sing to Me, which feels so urgent to our moment now. And I am glad that even if you yourself are not necessarily driven by hopefulness and optimism, Hani is. And as you say, we could all use to be a little bit more like Hani. And I'm grateful to have spent time with him in this novel, and grateful to you for the conversation, Jesse.
Well, thank you so much. It's been so interesting, and it was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Jesse Browner for coming on to talk about his gorgeous new novel, Sing to Me. You can find links to purchase Sing to Me and all of Jesse's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.